Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
It began with the faintest flicker, a hesitation in the air so subtle. Most would never have noticed it, but he did. He was a boy then, no older than 7, sitting on the back steps of his grandmother's quiet house, staring at the garden where moths drifted like pale scraps of paper. One moment, the wind had carried the smell of wet earth and crushed mint. The next it was gone, as though the world had briefly forgotten itself. The leaves stilled, the moths froze mid-flight, and time seemed to hold its breath before resuming again, gentle and unbothered, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet the boy's small chest tightened, for he had felt the pause in his bones like a skipped heartbeat. He told no one at first. How could he? What language could a child use to explain a silence that had no sound? Still, the memory clung to him like dew. Nights later, lying awake in bed, he would think of it again, the world folding in on itself, then smoothing out as if life was a cloth that someone unseen had tugged and set straight. The thought wasn't frightening. It was tender, strange, and oddly comforting, as though the universe itself was whispering a secret meant only for him. He began to notice smaller things after that. A neighbor passing by would greet him twice in almost the same tone, as if the moment had been gently rehearsed. A dog barking down the street would falter, then bark again in the same rhythm. To most ears it was nothing, a trick of repetition, but to him it was proof that the flicker was real. Each time it happened, the boy grew still, wide-eyed, not in fear, but in quiet awe. The world was teaching him, though he did not yet understand the lesson. His grandmother, patient and warm, would sometimes watch him stare too long at nothing. "Dreaming again?" she would ask with a smile, brushing flour from her apron. He would nod, though dreaming wasn't quite the word. There was no dream, no fantasy, only the deep sense that something beneath life's skin pulsed in secret. When she set warm bread in front of him, he noticed how the crust sometimes cracked twice, the sound repeating faintly like an echo from another room. He wanted to ask her if she noticed too, but the words stayed trapped behind his teeth. Perhaps it was a gift best kept quiet. Children, after all, are creatures of wonder, and he accepted the strangeness the way others accepted the rising of the sun. It became part of him. By the time he was 10, he had learned to wait for it. The pause, the repetition, the hidden rehearsal of reality. At times he would close his eyes and feel it arrive before it came, as though the air around him shifted in weight. He could never predict what would repeat a line of laughter, the tilt of a shadow, the sound of rain striking tin. But when it did, he felt a sweetness in his chest, a certainty that he was held by something larger than himself. There were afternoons when he wandered through fields of tall grass, his hands brushing against the stalks, and he would feel time stretch like taffy. The minutes elongated, the world softened, and he walked as though within a lullaby. He never hurried. He found no need. The bird song slowed to a gentler pace, and even the buzzing of bees felt like a hum meant to cradle him. He was still a boy, yet he was already carrying within him a secret rhythm that others did not know. The first person he ever spoke to about it was not family but a stranger. She was a woman at the marketplace, older, with hair pulled back and hands stained with herbs. She sold sandwiches wrapped in paper, and each week she would press one into his hands with the same words. "This will keep you steady." The phrase was always the same, always kind, though her tone shifted, sometimes tired, sometimes playful, sometimes almost tearful. He began to notice that even she repeated herself in ways no one else seemed to. One day, as he took the sandwich, he whispered, "You said that before." The woman only looked at him, her eyes softening as though she knew exactly what he meant. She didn't explain, didn't question. She only placed her hand lightly on his head and said, "And I'll say it again." He carried that moment home as though it were a treasure. For the first time, he felt less alone in his secret. Perhaps others knew. Perhaps the world was sprinkled with people who understood the flicker, the pause, the stretch. At night, he lay in bed listening to the hum of the house, the pipes shifting, the wind rattling the window pane, and he imagined that someone somewhere was carefully tuning time like the strings of an instrument, not to control it, not to trap it, but to make it gentler, softer, more bearable for those who needed it. He wondered if his noticing was meant to be part of the music. Perhaps he was not chosen, but simply listening better than most. Seasons passed, and the boy grew taller, his legs too long for the steps where he once sat, yet the moments of flicker followed him faithfully. It came in the classroom when the teacher's chalk screeched, paused, then screeched again in the same rhythm. They came in the laughter of his brother, repeating a note as though the world wanted him to remember joy, and they came most often when he was still watching clouds curl at the edges, watching the horizon darken into evening. These moments became a kind of prayer, wordless and steady. By 12, he had discovered that he could lean into them, stretch them wider. If he held his breath and softened his thoughts, the pause would grow longer, the air thick with silence, the world moving at half its usual pace. It was never for long, just enough to feel the edges of time blur. But it was his, a gift stitched quietly into his being. He did not boast of it. He did not test its limits. He simply kept it close, like a pocket stone he could hold, when the noise of life grew too heavy. The memory of the sandwich woman lingered in him, though he rarely saw her now. When he passed her stall, he noticed her eyes seeking him, gentle but knowing. He wondered if she, too, could stretch the world in her own way, or if she simply carried her kindness like a secret power. The thought comforted him. Powers, he realized, were not always grand or bright. Sometimes they were soft, hidden in gestures, stitched into words. And so his childhood unfolded not in haste, but in a rhythm slower than most. He learned his lessons, played with his brother, walked the familiar roads of his small town, but beneath it all, he listened. He listened for the flicker, the pause, the stretch. He listened to the hidden music of life, and it listened back. Though he was still only a boy, he felt the beginnings of something vast, a quiet journey that would carry him beyond what he could imagine. For now, though, he only lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the silence between breaths, waiting for the world to hold him still, if only for a moment before it began again. He carried the quiet strangeness of those early years with him as he grew, like a lantern cupped carefully in his palms. The moments of flicker, the pauses in reality, no longer startled him. They became companions, almost expected, woven into the fabric of his days. And yet as he stepped into the unsteady bridge between boyhood and adolescence, the mystery deepened rather than settled. It wasn't only the world that seemed to repeat. It was people, their gestures, their glances, their smallest choices. He began to see patterns in their lives as if each of them was caught in gentle loops, unaware of the rhythm guiding them. His brother, restless and impulsive, often laughed in bursts that came twice, a sharp echo of himself. Once when they were playing in the yard, chasing each other through the dust, the boy watched his brother stumble, fall, and rise again, only for the scene to repeat itself almost identically. A blink, a pause, a skipped beat, and there he was, falling again in the same place, in the same way. His brother groaned, brushing dirt from his knees, never realizing the odd repetition. The boy felt the air ripple, and he stood there quietly, filled with wonder, and just a touch of loneliness. Why was he the only one awake to it? At school, the feeling grew sharper. Teachers spoke, their chalk tapping against the board, and sometimes the sound doubled. A lesson would falter, then begin again, nearly word for word, as though the day itself had been pulled back and replayed. His classmates never seemed to notice. They scribbled notes, whispered jokes, drifted in and out of their own small universes. He, meanwhile, sat very still, watching the thin line between what had been and what was happening now. The more he paid attention, the more he realized that life itself seemed rehearsed, like a play with lines spoken twice until they sounded just right. And though it might have made him uneasy, it did not. The boy found it strangely comforting, as if something was gently guiding the world, smoothing its edges, offering second chances. The pauses, the flickers, the echoes. They were not accidents. They were mercies. He began to wonder if the universe repeated moments, not out of error but out of kindness, to let people linger where they might have otherwise stumbled. There was a girl in his class who dropped her pencil nearly every morning. It would clatter to the floor, roll beneath a desk, and she would sigh, cheeks pink with embarrassment. You noticed that on some mornings, she dropped it twice, in exactly the same way. And yet on those days, she smiled a little wider when she retrieved it, as though the repetition had softened the sting. Watching her, he thought, the world lets her practice her small sorrows until they weigh less. That thought stayed with him, warm and strange, a secret thread connecting him to people in ways they would never know. One autumn afternoon, when the air smelled of wood smoke and distant rain, he found himself sitting again on the steps outside his grandmother's house. Though he was older now, taller, his legs stretching further down the stairs, he closed his eyes, listening, waiting, and it came, the pause, the stillness, the shiver in the air. But this time, he leaned into it more deeply than ever before. He breathed in slowly, and the pause stretched wider, until it seemed he could hear the world sighing all around him. The leaves did not merely still, they shimmered, caught in a silence too profound for words. His heart slowed, his thoughts loosened. For a moment, he felt weightless, as though he might dissolve into the quiet itself. When the world resumed, he opened his eyes and noticed his grandmother watching from the kitchen window. She didn't ask him what he was doing, nor did she seem surprised. Instead, she gave him a small nod, the kind reserved for secrets unspoken. He wondered then, fleetingly, if she knew more than she had ever told him. As days turned to weeks, the boy began experimenting with his strange awareness. He would pause in the middle of conversation, tilt his head, and wait for the flicker. Sometimes he could anticipate it, feeling the air grow heavy, like a curtain preparing to fall. Other times it came uninvited, when he was least expecting it, and he would be carried by it like a leaf drifting on water. He discovered that if he softened his thoughts, if he let go of trying to grasp or control, it came more often. It was not a power to be wielded, but a gift to be received. His brother grew impatient with him. "You're always off in your head," he would say, tossing a stone at his feet to pull him back. "Why don't you play like everyone else?" The boy only smiled faintly, unwilling to explain. His brother's world was fast, restless, filled with motion. His own was slower, deeper, filled with echoes and silences. They loved each other, yet they moved at different tempos, and neither could quite keep pace with the other. Still, the boy cherished his brother's presence, for even in his hurried laughter, he sometimes caught the familiar ripple, the sound of joy replaying itself, as if the world wanted him to notice. The marketplace woman lingered in his thoughts as well. On rare days when their paths crossed, she still handed him a sandwich and repeated her gentle phrase. Each time it landed differently in him, sometimes like comfort, sometimes like a reminder, sometimes like a quiet mystery. He began to realize that words themselves could be like echoes, carrying layers of meaning with each repetition. A sentence spoken twice was never truly the same. It carried the memory of its first life within it. As he entered his teenage years, the boy's sense of the world became even more finely tuned. He began to sense not only the pauses, but the subtle emotions they carried. A flicker during an argument would soften anger. A pause in laughter would deepen connection. A repeated phrase between friends would carry unspoken tenderness. Life itself was teaching him that repetition was not emptiness. It was fullness, a layering of meaning that grew richer each time. One evening, lying beneath the stars, he whispered to himself, "The world is kind." He wasn't sure why he felt it so strongly, but the flickers had convinced him. They were not mistakes. They were gifts, small as breadcrumbs leading him towards something larger. He closed his eyes and listened for the silence between his breaths, and in that space he felt less alone. He did not know yet what this gift would mean for his life, or why it had chosen him, but he sensed that it was shaping him quietly, gently, like water carving stone. He was no longer only a boy who noticed strange pauses. He was becoming someone who understood their weight. The world whispered to him in repetitions, and he carried its whispers like a secret melody. And so he grew, year by year, walking the thin line between ordinary days and the hidden rhythm beneath them. He was still a child in many ways, but already he was beginning to grow into something else. A listener, a keeper of echoes, a boy whose heart beat in time with a mystery that most would never hear. And as sleep found him in those quiet nights, he thought again of the lantern he carried within himself. It flickered softly, just as the world once had, and it promised that the path ahead, however strange, would be lit by a gentleness older than he could ever understand. He thought often of her, the woman at the marketplace with hands that smelled of herbs and bread, the one who gave him sandwiches wrapped in paper and words wrapped in care. As the years moved quietly forward, his memory of her did not fade. Instead, it deepened, as though the pauses in the world had chosen her as one of their soft anchors. He was older now, his shoulders beginning to broaden, his gaze steady and thoughtful. But when he walked through the bustle of the market, the comfort of her presence felt the same as it had when he was a child. She was never hurried, never sharp. Even when her stall was crowded and coins clinked impatiently against her wooden counter, she moved as though she had all the time in the world. And every time she handed him food, her familiar phrase came quiet, consistent, echoing across the years, "This will keep you steady." By now he had learned to hear it differently. When he was younger, it had sounded like a blessing. Now it sounded like a reminder, one meant to carry him beyond her stall and into the world. He often wondered if she knew the gift she was giving him was larger than bread. Her voice lingered with him long after he'd eaten, woven into the strange rhythm of echoes and pauses that shaped his days. He began to sense that her words carried the same quiet repetition as the world itself, phrases that softened over time, gaining depth instead of wearing thin. One afternoon, when the sun hung low and golden across the rooftops, he lingered by her stall longer than usual. He watched her fold the paper carefully around each sandwich, her fingers precise, her movements almost ritual. At last, when she pressed one into his hand, he found the courage to ask, "Why do you always say it like that?" His voice was uncertain, trembling slightly with the weight of the question he had carried for years. She looked at him, her eyes gentle and searching. For a moment, she didn't speak, and he thought perhaps she hadn't heard him. But then she smiled, small and knowing. "Because it's true," she said simply. and some truths need to be spoken more than once. She turned to serve another customer, leaving him to stand there, stunned by the quiet wisdom of her reply. He carried it home that evening, repeating it silently to himself. Some truths need to be spoken more than once. The thought filled him with warmth, as though the world had whispered another secret into his ear. In the days that followed, he began to notice how people spoke in repetitions without even realizing it. His grandmother humming the same tune as she kneaded dough. His brother muttering the same complaint each time chores were asked of him. Friends at school repeating jokes until they lost their sharpness, but not their comfort. Life was filled with refrains, soft echoes that tied moments together, and he wondered if perhaps this was the way the world reminded people of what mattered most, by giving them another chance to hear it, another chance to understand. The marketplace woman became more than just a kind figure in his life. She became a thread of continuity, grounding him each time he passed her stall. When his brother teased him for being distracted, when school days grew heavy with lessons that didn't seem to matter, when nights stretched long and restless with questions he couldn't answer, she was there, steady, repeating her quiet ritual. She never asked what weighed on him. She never demanded his secrets, yet he felt she understood more than she said. One evening, rain began to fall as he walked home, and he stopped beneath an awning to wait it out. The paper around his sandwich grew damp, softening at the edges, but the words she had spoken earlier that day repeated themselves in his mind. "This will keep you steady." He unwrapped the bread slowly, biting into its warmth as the rain tapped gently all around him. And in that moment, he realized that steadiness wasn't just about food or strength. It was about the repetition itself, the rhythm of care given again and again, until it became a foundation beneath his feet. He thought, too, of how the pauses in the world felt the same. They came not once but many times, patient and consistent, as if reminding him of something he might otherwise forget. Perhaps, he thought, kindness itself was a form of repetition, acts so small they seemed invisible, until their echoes built a song too steady to ignore. The woman must have sensed this truth as well, for her kindness never wavered. There was a day when he arrived at the market empty-handed, pockets bare, his brother having taken what little coin they had for himself. He approached the stall uncertain, ashamed, but before he could stammer out an apology, she pressed a sandwich into his hand as usual. "This will keep you steady," she said, her tone softer than ever, her gaze unwavering. He wanted to protest, to explain, but her look silenced him. That day, more than any other, he understood that repetition was not habit. It was devotion. Years seemed to gather like fallen leaves, and still her presence endured. He grew taller, his voice deeper, his responsibilities heavier. Yet when he stood before her stall, he felt the same quiet comfort as when he had first heard her phrase. She was not his family by blood, not his mentor by design, but she had become one of the figures who shaped the hidden rhythm of his life. When he thought of steadiness, he thought of her. When he thought of kindness, he thought of the way she repeated her words until they became part of him. Sometimes, lying awake at night, he wondered what her own pauses were, what echoes her life held. Did someone whisper to her the same way she whispered to him? Did she have her own unseen lantern, flickering quietly within her chest? He never asked, and she never told, yet the question wrapped itself around his thoughts like a blanket. Perhaps, he thought, everyone carried echoes. Perhaps the world gave each person a secret rhythm to keep them steady. And so his life continued, guided not by grand revelations, but by these small, repeated gifts. The pauses in time, the echoes of laughter, the steady ritual of kindness. These were the lessons that shaped him. The woman at the marketplace remained his quiet anchor, her presence a reminder that even in a world filled with mystery, there were constants that could be trusted. Her words followed him like a lullaby, steadying him when the road grew uncertain, echoing softly whenever he felt adrift. He did not know then how much her presence would mean to him in the years to come, or how deeply her simple phrase would root itself in the fabric of his being. For now, it was enough to walk home with bread in his hands and warmth in his heart, listening to the steady rhythm of life repeating itself around him, carrying him gently into the unknown. There came a point when he could no longer think of the pauses, the flickers, as something that simply happened to him. They had been a quiet backdrop for so long, a gentle strangeness that shaped his childhood without asking for his participation. But as the years carried him further from boyhood, something in the air began to shift. The pauses felt different now, not just gifts for him to notice, but spaces where he could lean in, touch the edges, and guide them ever so slightly. It was as though the lantern he had carried all his life had grown brighter, illuminating paths he had never considered. It began quietly, without intention. One afternoon he was walking home, the sky a soft wash of gray, when he noticed an old man struggling to cross the street. The traffic was not heavy, but it was unrelenting. each carriage and cart rushing forward with little regard for him. The boy's chest tightened as he watched the man hesitate at the curb, and then, as if the world had heard his silent ache, the flicker came. The air thickened, sound bent, and the moment stretched into something slower, softer. The wheels of the carts seemed to turn reluctantly, their motion syrup-thick, the shouts of drivers echoing twice as though trapped in a dream. The boy's pulse slowed with it. In that wide, steady pause, the old man stepped safely across, his cane tapping firmly on the stone, his shoulders unhurried for the first time all day. When the world resumed, no one noticed anything had changed, except the boy, whose heart was racing with the realization that perhaps it hadn't only been the world's mercy. Perhaps he had willed it to be so. The thought unsettled him, not in fear, but in awe. He replayed it in his mind for days, unsure if it was his doing or simply another kindness of the universe. But deep down, he knew he had leaned into the moment differently this time. He had not merely witnessed it, he had joined it. He had pulled gently on the thread of silence and felt it respond to him, pliant and willing. After that, he began to test it, though never recklessly. He was not the sort to chase spectacle, nor did he imagine himself powerful. Instead, he experimented in the smallest of ways, always with care, always with reverence. When his brother, hot-tempered as ever, began to shout over some trivial frustration, the boy softened his breath, waiting for the flicker, and when it came, he leaned into it, stretching the moment wider. The anger that had burned in his brother's face seemed to cool in the elongated silence, the repeated words of complaint sounding less sharp, less heavy. By the time the moment released, the storm had gentled, leaving his brother blinking in confusion, calmer than he expected to be. The boy said nothing of what he had done, but in his heart he knew. It became a quiet habit, slowing time not for himself but for others. A teacher about to lose patience with a rowdy classroom, a friend trembling before speaking their truth aloud, a child who tripped, face about to meet the ground, only to find themselves steadied by time itself. These were not miracles in the eyes of those who lived them. They were ordinary mercies, invisible and unremarked upon. But for the boy, each one was a revelation. His gift was not only to notice the pauses, it was to widen them, to lend the world a little more gentleness when it was most needed. Yet with each use came questions that settled heavily in him. Who else could do this? Was he meant to? Was there a purpose hidden in the echoes and flickers that he had not yet uncovered? At night he lay awake, listening to the silence between breaths, wondering if he was meddling in something sacred or simply fulfilling what had always been his role. He wanted to ask someone, anyone, but who could he trust with such strangeness? The marketplace woman's steady gaze came to mind, her phrase echoing like a refrain. This will keep you steady. Perhaps she had always known he would need steadiness for a reason greater than sandwiches and kindness. But still, he kept his silence. Some truths, he thought, needed to be carried alone until the world itself was ready to receive them. He became more careful with his experiments. He learned that leaning too hard into the pauses left him dizzy, as if his body resented being stretched. He learned that the flickers responded better when his heart was tender than when it was desperate, and he learned that time was not a thread to be pulled without consequence. It was a river, and one could only touch its surface without disturbing the current too much. These discoveries did not discourage him. They humbled him. He was not the master of this gift, only its steward. In the quiet of his grandmother's kitchen, he sometimes practiced when no one was watching. He would watch the steam rise from a teacup, breathe softly, and wait for the pause. When it came, he would hold it just long enough to watch the steam hang motionless in the air, a delicate sculpture of breath and heat. Then he would release it, and the world would sigh back into motion. He told no one, but he smiled to himself, knowing that even if his gift remained a secret forever, it was a secret that brought him closer to the rhythm of the universe itself. As adolescence stretched toward the cusp of adulthood, he began to see the gift less as strangeness and more as calling. He did not yet know its full purpose, but he knew it was not meant for grand displays or personal gain. It was meant for small kindnesses, for moments no one else would even realize had been saved. The world did not need him to be a hero and shining light. It needed him to be a shadow of mercy, quiet and unseen, widening the pauses so others might breathe a little easier. And though he still did not have all the answers, though questions pressed at him in the silence of night, he carried on with patience. He trusted that the pauses themselves would reveal more in time, just as they always had. The lantern within him glowed brighter now, steady and sure, lighting the narrow path ahead. For in every flicker, in every repetition, in every stretched breath of silence, he felt the world whispering, "This is who you are meant to be." His brother became the quiet axis around which his gift was most often tested. The boy had always been the steadier of the two, the one who listened more than he spoke, while his brother lived in a blaze of motion and impatience. Their closeness had always been stitched with contrasts, one fiery, one calm, one reaching outward, the other inward. And yet beneath those differences lay a bond neither words nor quarrels could undo. As the pauses grew more responsive to his will, he noticed how often they appeared in moments involving his brother, as if the bond itself was a thread that tugged the gift awake. It happened most vividly one autumn evening. The streets were restless with the wind, scattering leaves like sparks along the stones. His brother, taller now, shoulders broader with the impatience of youth, was arguing with a friend at the edge of the square. Voices clashed, sharp and rising, the kind of heat that attracts a crowd. The boy stood at the edge, his lantern-like awareness flickering. His brother's fists were tight, his words faster than his own thoughts, and the friend's face mirrored the same fury. The boy's heart ached, not out of fear of violence, but out of sorrow that anger might carve a canyon between them. And then, like the slow draw of a curtain, the pause unfurled. Time softened, the voices echoed strangely, words repeating twice, stretched and hollow. He stepped closer, heart steady, and laid a hand on his brother's arm. In the extended silence, the heat drained from his brother's expression. The boy did not speak, did not force peace, but the stretched breath between words allowed something else to slip in, a memory perhaps, of laughter shared, or the invisible thread of loyalty that bound them. When the moment released, his brother blinked, shoulders loosening, his words tumbling out quieter than before. The quarrel did not vanish, but its edge dulled, its fire reduced to embers. The friend, too, seemed caught off guard by the sudden shift, and the tension dissolved into an uneasy but fragile calm. That night, lying awake in the small room they shared, his brother turned to him in the dark. "You always know when to stop me," he said quietly, almost grudgingly, "like you see something I don't." The boy said nothing at first, staring at the ceiling where moonlight traced faint lines. Then he whispered, "Maybe I only see the pause you leave behind." His brother didn't understand the words, but he accepted them, rolling back to sleep with a sigh. The boy lay awake longer, his heart both heavy and light, knowing he had spoken a truth without revealing its depth. It became clearer with each passing season that his brother would always be a mirror, showing him the limits and possibilities of his gift. Where his brother surged, he steadied. Where his brother scattered, he gathered. They were not opposites, meant to clash, but halves meant to balance. Yet the boy wondered how long that balance could last. His brother longed for horizons, for roads beyond their village, for victories to prove his strength. The boy longed only for stillness, for the hush between breaths, for the mercy of pauses. It seemed inevitable that one day their paths would diverge. And yet the pauses did not only appear in moments of conflict. There were gentler times too, woven into the fabric of their bond. On nights when the wind howled and their grandmother's roof creaked, the brothers would lie close, whispering stories to pass the hours. In those fragile moments, the boy would feel the flicker humming between them, slowing the world just enough to let the warmth linger longer. He never told his brother, but he cherished those stretched silences more than any experiment or secret triumph. They were proof that his gift was not only about preventing harm, but about deepening what was already tender. Still, the boy could not ignore the weight of questions pressing in. Was the gift tied to his brother for a reason? Did the universe demand he guard him, guide him, steady him through storms, unseen? Or was it simply that love, fierce and unbreakable, gave the pauses their shape? These questions walked with him everywhere, into markets, fields, and dreams, whispering in the echoes only he could hear. One evening, as dusk painted the village in copper and violet, his brother pulled him aside. "I can't stay here forever," he said, voice low but brimming with certainty. "There's more beyond these streets. I can feel it." The boy listened, heart tightening. He knew this was not a threat, not even a plan yet, but a seed of inevitability. His brother's restlessness was no less real than his own need for quiet. And though fear stirred in him, the boy also understood. The lantern within him did not glow to bind his brother down, but to guide him wherever the road might lead. That night, as his brother slept easily beside him, the boy lay awake with the flickers humming like a chorus. He imagined a road stretching out, his brother's steps quick and eager upon it. He imagined himself walking behind, not to hold him back, but to watch over him in the pauses, steadying the world when it threatened to break him. The thought both comforted and burdened him. Perhaps this was the shape of his purpose, not to keep the world steady for himself, but to keep it steady for those he loved most. And so, as the seasons turned again, he leaned into the pauses with new resolve. Each flicker was not just a wonder, not just a secret experiment, but a preparation for storms he could not yet name, for roads his brother had not yet taken, for the day when steadiness and restlessness would part ways, and the lantern's glow would need to shine far beyond the safety of their shared roof. For now, he kept silent, steady as always. But deep within, he knew every pause was leading him toward that inevitable parting, and when it came, he would have to decide how far the gift could carry him. The decision did not come all at once, but like the slow thaw of winter, it arrived in fragments. His brother began speaking less of the village and more of the world beyond it, his eyes often drifting past the horizon as though the fields and riverbanks were no longer enough to contain his restless spirit. At first, it was only idle talk stories overheard at the marketplace, rumors of distant towns where the streets were lit by lanterns brighter than stars, places where fortunes could be carved from stone or steel. But as weeks passed, the words sharpened into intentions, and the boy felt the shift like a quiet ache beneath the ribs. One evening, his brother stood at the edge of their small home, staring out at the darkening sky. "I'll leave soon," he said without turning. The boy's breath caught, though he had long known this moment was approaching. His brother's voice held no anger, no bitterness, only certainty. It was not a rejection of home, nor of family, but the fulfillment of something that had always lived in him, the need to test himself against the vastness of the world. The boy nodded softly, though his throat was tight. He did not beg him to stay. He did not argue. He simply watched the way his brother's silhouette seemed almost already part of the night, half gone, half here. The days leading up to the departure passed like a dream stretched thin. Their grandmother prepared meals with unusual care, her hands slower, her eyes lingering longer on her grandson as if memorizing every gesture. Neighbors offered advice disguised as casual remarks, stories of dangers and temptations beyond the village, though none could dull the gleam in his brother's eyes. The boy felt the flickers humming constantly now, restless, as if the pauses themselves anticipated the parting. Sometimes they came without his bidding. Moments where time softened for no reason at all, where the clink of a spoon or the laughter of a neighbor stretched just enough for him to notice. It was as though the world was reminding him, you are not losing him, only learning how to follow differently. On the morning of his brother's leaving, the air was heavy with mist. The boy woke before dawn, listening to the quiet rustle of his brother packing what little he had. He lay still, memorizing the sound, the way cloth folded, the soft clink of a belt buckle, the pause between movements, as though even his brother too was lingering in the silence. Finally he rose, and without words, they walked together to the edge of the village. There were no grand farewells, no crowd to witness, just the two of them standing where the dirt road bent into the trees. His brother clasped his shoulder firmly, his voice steady. "You'll be all right here," he said, though the boy knew he was speaking partly to himself. The boy wanted to tell him of the gift, to confess the truth of the pauses, to promise that he would always be with him no matter the distance. But the words stayed behind his teeth, too heavy for the moment. Instead, he whispered, "I'll walk with you a little." So they walked together in the mist until the fields gave way to forest, their steps quiet, their breaths visible in the chilled air. At one point, his brother began humming a tune their grandmother used to sing, a half-forgotten lullaby about rivers and stars. The boy joined softly, and the melody wove between them like a thread. For a moment he thought perhaps the pause had opened again, but no, this was only the natural slowing of time when love deepens. When the moment finally came, when the boy could walk no farther without abandoning the home that still needed him, they stood once more in silence. His brother looked at him, eyes bright not with tears, but with resolve. "I'll send word," he promised. The boy nodded, and as his brother turned down the road alone, he felt the pause swell unbidden. Time slowed, the mist thickened, the sound of footsteps stretched like echoes in a cavern. The boy did not resist it. He let it linger, let himself watch his brother's figure carried slowly into distance, imprinting every detail, the swing of his arms, the tilt of his head, the certainty in his stride. When the pause released, the road was empty, but for the echo of his absence. The boy stood a long while after, until the mist thinned and the morning sun broke through. The silence in him was not hollow but weighty, filled with something unnamed. Walking back toward the village, he realized the pauses had changed. They no longer felt like secrets hidden for play or protection. They now felt like a bond stretched across distance, a way to remain tethered to someone who was no longer beside him. He wondered with quiet awe if his brother could feel it too. If miles away he might sense a breath of stillness when he needed it most. Life in the village resumed its gentle rhythm. He worked beside his grandmother, carried water from the well, listened to the whispers of neighbors. Outwardly, nothing seemed different. Yet inwardly, everything had shifted. Each day carried a subtle ache of absence, but also a new strength. He found himself pausing more often, listening longer, speaking with greater care. It was as though his brother's leaving had stretched him too, into a new shape. The pauses were no longer only for him. They became a gift he could share with others. When an elder stumbled in the street, he reached her before the fall could deepen, the world slowing just enough to let him catch her. When a child's laughter rose into the night, he felt the pause hold it in the air, giving everyone nearby an extra heartbeat to savor it. Yet beneath all this quiet service, he carried the constant wonder. How far could the pauses travel? Could they cross fields, forests, cities? Could they reach his brother, somewhere beyond the horizon, guiding him as they always had? The question stayed with him like a refrain, unanswered but alive, urging him onward. And though his body remained in the village, his spirit had already begun its own journey, one that stretched not toward roads and cities, but inward toward the vast, uncharted country of silence and light. And somewhere in the marrow of his being, he knew this was only the beginning of what the pauses were meant for. His brother had stepped into the world, and soon enough he would have to follow not by foot alone, but by the glow of the lantern within him. The days after his brother's departure unfolded with an unfamiliar stillness. The boy continued his tasks, drawing water, mending tools, listening to his grandmother's stories, but the air felt stretched, as though something essential had been pulled from its center. At first the ache was sharp, like a wound, but soon it softened into a quiet rhythm, a longing that hummed alongside his every breath. He found himself glancing at the horizon more often, as if expecting his brother's figure to reappear at any moment, though deep within he knew the road would not return him so quickly. It was during these days of adjustment that the pauses began to reveal something new. One afternoon, as he sat by the riverbank watching reeds sway in the current, the air folded into stillness without his asking. He leaned into it, eyes closed, and in that suspended hush, he felt something impossible, an echo of footsteps not his own. They were quick, purposeful, restless, like the rhythm of someone walking a long road. His heart tightened. He did not see his brother, nor hear his voice, but he felt him as if the pause had stretched across the miles to carry a fragment of his presence back home. When the stillness released, the river rushed again, and he was alone, yet he carried with him the certainty that distance had not severed their bond. The awareness grew stronger in the nights that followed. While the village slept, he would sit awake by the hearth, breathing with the pauses, listening. Sometimes he felt laughter, distant and bright, sometimes exhaustion, heavy as stone, sometimes a flicker of loneliness that mirrored his own. He never told his grandmother, though she noticed the way his gaze seemed far away, the way he lingered in silences, as if conversing with something unseen. She only touched his hair one evening and murmured, "You are becoming more than I ever imagined," her voice filled with both pride and worry. Meanwhile, life in the village pressed on with its familiar demands. He helped repair roofs after the heavy rains, carried baskets for neighbors, soothed quarrels before they could bloom into rifts. The pauses were no longer a secret plaything. They had become a tool of quiet service. With each use, he noticed how naturally others leaned into him, trusting his presence without knowing why. Children reached for his hand during storms. Elders confided in him, certain he would understand. He rarely spoke much, but in the stillness he offered, people seemed to find their own clarity. It was a gift he gave quietly, without recognition, and that was enough. And yet, beyond the surface of daily life, he felt the thread pulling. His brother's journey unfolded like a faint melody in another room, distant but audible. He sensed nights when his brother walked long roads beneath starlight, meals eaten hurriedly at strangers' tables, and moments of pride when he proved his strength in unfamiliar places. Sometimes, when the pauses deepened, he thought he almost caught a glimpse, a flicker of lanterns in a crowded street, or the echo of his brother's voice bargaining with merchants. Whether these were true visions or only the shape of longing, he could not say, but each left him both comforted and unsettled, for they reminded him that the bond was alive, stretching wider than he had ever imagined. One evening, as he helped an old man lift a fallen branch from the path, the pause bloomed without warning. The world hushed, the air thickened, and within that silence he felt not just his brother, but something else, a presence sharp and unfamiliar, like steel drawn across stone. His chest tightened, and for a moment fear flickered in him. Whatever his brother faced, it was no longer the gentle trials of restlessness, but something heavier, something that might wound. When the pause broke, He stood trembling in the dim light, the old man looking at him with concern. "You all right, lad?" the elder asked. The boy only nodded, though inside he knew the truth. His brother's journey was no longer only a test of distance, but of survival. That night he could not sleep. He sat by the window staring into the dark fields, his hands clenched as if trying to hold the thread taut. He whispered into the silence, though no one could hear, "Be steady, brother. Let the world soften for you." The pauses answered with their slow, steady breath, and though he could not change what lay ahead, he felt the faint assurance that his presence reached across the miles like a lantern in the fog. In the days that followed, he began to see his role differently. He was not meant only to keep the village safe or to offer small mercies. His gift was also a bridge, a way of carrying love across distance, a way of reminding those far away that they were never truly alone. It was both humbling and terrifying, for if he could sense his brother's steps, then perhaps his brother could sense his steadiness, even without knowing why. It meant that what he carried inside him was not only his own secret, it was a bond that could sustain another soul. Still, he felt the weight of uncertainty. How far could the pauses reach? Would they stretch across mountains, across seas, or would they thin and fade, leaving him grasping at shadows? The questions circled endlessly, but he did not let them drown him. Instead, he tended to the tasks of the day, weaving baskets, listening to children's chatter, helping his grandmother with herbs. Life had to be lived in its small, steady ways, even as the deeper current carried him towards something unseen. One twilight, as he returned from the fields, the horizon glowed with the last light of the sun. He paused there, watching the sky fade into indigo, and felt the gift stir once more. The silence spread wide, stretching beyond the fields, beyond the hills, beyond even his sight, and in that breathless stillness, he felt his brother again, walking, weary, but moving forward. He sensed the determination in his steps, the faint tremor of fatigue, and then, unexpectedly, a surge of joy like laughter rising after long silence. The boy smiled softly, tears pricking his eyes. Though they were apart, though the road between them grew longer each day, they were still walking together, bound by pauses that no distance could break. When the stillness released, the night settled around him like a cloak. He whispered into the dark, "Keep walking, I'm with you." And he knew that somewhere, perhaps without understanding why, his brother would feel a flicker of warmth, a reminder that he was never alone on the road. The first true trial came quietly, as such things often do, disguised not as a storm but as a bend in the road. His brother had been traveling for weeks by then, moving through small towns where faces blurred together, where each new morning meant another unfamiliar street and another night meant the hard floor of a stranger's barn or the open sky. The boy could not see these places with his eyes, yet through the pauses he felt them in fragments. The uneven rhythm of steps across cobblestones, the hush of conversations held in languages he barely understood, the weariness of shoulders carrying more than they should. And then one night, the connection deepened into something heavier, pulling at him like a tide. He woke suddenly from sleep, breath sharp in the stillness of his small room. The pause had stretched itself wide, wider than ever before, enveloping him in a silence so deep it seemed to press against his skin. Within that silence, he felt his brother's presence, frantic and unsteady. There were voices around him, unfamiliar, harsh, and the unmistakable tension of a choice. The boy sat upright, palms pressed together as though in prayer. Listen, he could not make out words, but he sensed the outlines. His brother, cornered in some crowded place, offered something tempting and dangerous, the kind of offer that sharpens itself against youthful pride. The boy's heart pounded, but he did not panic. Instead, he leaned into the silence, breathing with it, letting it slow his racing thoughts. If he had learned anything, it was that the pauses were not meant to be forced. They were meant to be held gently, like a bird cupped in the hands. So he waited, letting the stillness deepen, until he felt the storm within his brother ease just slightly. His brother's breath slowed, the sharp edges of his fear dulled. The boy whispered into the dark, though no one else could hear, "Wait, just wait." And somehow, across the distance, his brother did. When the pause released, the boy fell back against his blanket, trembling with both relief and awe. He did not know what choice his brother had made, only that it had not been rash. And though he would never tell anyone, he felt certain that the silence had saved him. The following days, the boy moved through the village, carrying the secret weight of what had passed. While his hands mended nets and fetched water, his mind replayed the moment, the way the pause had stretched itself to catch his brother before he could fall. He wondered if this was what the gift was meant for, not only to ease quarrels or soften grief, but to guide someone walking far from home, to steady them at the edge of choices that could not be undone. The thought filled him with both gratitude and fear. Gratitude that the bond between them was unbroken. Fear that his brother's road would only grow more treacherous. That fear proved justified, for soon the pauses began to bring darker echoes, moments of hunger that gnawed at his brother's strength, nights where he slept with one hand clenched around nothing, as if even in dreams he prepared to defend himself. Once in the middle of tending the fire, the boy felt a searing pain ripple through the pause, sharp and fleeting, like the bite of a blade grazing skin. He gasped aloud, startling his grandmother, though he quickly pretended it was nothing. Inside, however, he shook with the knowledge that his brother was being tested in ways that went beyond mere weariness. And yet not all the echoes were grim. Sometimes laughter broke through, rough and sudden, carrying the warmth of new companions. Sometimes there was a quiet pride, the satisfaction of surviving another day on the road. These moments comforted the boy, reminding him that his brother's journey was not only hardship but also discovery. Still, he learned to stay alert, listening always for the subtle shifts that signaled danger, ready to stretch the silence whenever it was needed. One twilight, as the boy walked back from the fields, the pause overtook him so swiftly he nearly stumbled. The air froze, the light dimmed, and within the hush he felt his brother standing in some crowded hall, a circle of eyes watching him. Pride burned in his chest. Anger, too. The kind of reckless fire that always made him bold. The boy's breath caught. He knew that fire well. It was the same force that once led to quarrels in the square. The same fire that could consume as quickly as it could inspire. He whispered again into the stillness, voice trembling but firm. Be steady. Do not let them draw you too far. The silence pulsed, carrying his words, or perhaps only the feeling of them, into the distance. Slowly he felt his brother's rage cool, replaced by something heavier but safer, restraint. The boy exhaled, shoulders sagging, as the pause released him back into the dim evening light. He realized then that the bond was no longer just a thread of memory or longing. It was an active current, a river flowing between them, carrying strength from one shore to another. That night, as he sat by the hearth, his grandmother noticed the faraway look in his eyes. You're listening again, she said softly, not as a question, but as a truth. He hesitated, then nodded. For the first time, he allowed himself to answer. He's still walking, he whispered, but the road is hard. His grandmother placed a hand over his, her touch warm and steady. Then walk with him, as best you can, even if your feet never leave this place. Love can travel farther than you think. Her words sank into him like water into thirsty earth. Yes, he thought. That was what the pauses truly were. Love stretched across silence, finding its way into places where no voice could reach. He fell asleep that night with a quiet resolve, ready for whatever echoes would come, knowing that he would meet them with steadiness. And in the deep hours, when the world itself seemed to sleep, the pause opened one more time. This time it was gentler, carrying not fear nor pride, but a simple image. His brother sitting by a fire, staring into the flames, eyes softened with thought. For the first time in many days, the boy smiled in his sleep, reassured that even on roads unknown, his brother still carried pieces of their shared quiet. The gift had grown larger than he had ever imagined, and yet he sensed it was still only beginning to show its true reach. The days that followed seemed gentler. Though the boy knew better than to trust the quiet completely, the pauses still came soft and unannounced, carrying glimpses of his brother's road, the creak of wooden wheels along a caravan path, the smell of dust rising from dry earth, the laughter of strangers whose faces he could only imagine. Through these moments, the boy began to realize that his brother was no longer walking alone. Shapes of companionship, faint and uncertain, entered the silence. A hand passing bread, a voice lifting in song by the fire, footsteps that matched his brother's stride, instead of opposing it. At first the boy felt relief, for he had feared the road might devour his brother whole. Yet as the bond deepened, a new tension stirred within him. Companions could be shelter, yes, but they could also be peril. He could sense how his brother's guarded pride softened in their company, how trust so long withheld began to take root again. That softening was beautiful, and it frightened him, for trust was a gift, but it was also a blade, and blades could cut in more than one direction. One evening, while the boy helped his grandmother untangle a fishing net, the pause widened again. He froze, fingers still caught in the weave as the hush drew him inward. This time the silence held voices clearer than before. A young woman laughed, the sound bright and unburdened, and his brother's heart answered with a quick, unsteady beat. The boy felt it within himself. That surge of warmth tangled with fear, He did not know her name, nor her face, but he knew what it meant. His brother was beginning to belong to others, not just to him. The boy pressed his lips together, unsure whether to feel comfort or jealousy. For so long, the pauses had been a secret path, only the two of them shared. To feel another presence in that bond, however faint, was both wondrous and painful. His chest tightened as though the thread between them had stretched further, tugged by unseen hands. Still, he did not pull away. He leaned into the silence and whispered, "Choose carefully." He doubted his brother heard the words, yet the pause seemed to carry them away, dissolving into the hum of voices, far beyond his reach. As weeks folded into one another, these glimpses grew sharper. Sometimes his brother's laughter reached him like sunlight scattered across water. Sometimes the weight of loyalty pressed against him, heavy but steady, as though oaths were being formed by firelight. And sometimes, more troubling than all, the pause would bring the taste of bitterness, sharp as ash, when trust met disappointment. Through it all, the boy learned something new. The gift was not just a window but a mirror. His brother's heart, reflected across the distance, revealed truths that words would have hidden. The boy began to change with it. He listened differently to those around him, the murmurs of neighbors, the cadence of his grandmother's prayers, the quiet of the river at dawn. He found himself noticing how trust moved like a tide, pulling people closer or casting them adrift. Where once he might have turned inward, now he watched more closely, as if preparing himself for the world his brother was already walking. The pauses taught him that no road was ever walked alone, even when it seemed so. Then came a night, unlike the others. He had been drifting towards sleep when the silence yawned open, wider and deeper than ever before. It carried him into a place of sharp light and clashing sound, metal striking metal, voices raised not in laughter but in fury. His brother was no longer at the edge of quarrels or the brink of choices. He was within something larger, a conflict that gathered many hearts at once. The boy felt it all at once, fear laced with determination, the desperate grip of hands clutching at loyalty, the sting of betrayal from someone once trusted. The boy clutched his blanket, breath uneven, feeling as though he too stood in that circle of fire. He wanted to cry out, to beg his brother to step back, to remind him that not every fight was worth the cost. But the pause was merciless in its honesty, showing him that retreat was no longer possible. His brother had tied himself to others in ways that could not be undone. All the boy could do was hold steady, pouring his own calm into the silence. A steady rhythm against the chaos. "Stand firm," he whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "But do not let the fire take you whole." When the pause finally released him, the boy lay in the dark, shaking. He realized then that his brother's journey was no longer only about survival. It was about belonging, about finding a place among others, and with that came both protection and danger. The road had grown beyond two brothers connected by silence. It had become a tapestry of many threads tangled and burning. The boy did not sleep much that night. Instead, he sat by the dying embers of the hearth, watching the last flames flicker. His grandmother stirred once, opening her eyes to see him there. She did not ask questions, only said softly, "Love is never simple, child. It grows by reaching outward, even when it aches." Her words sank deep, like stones thrown into water. He knew she was right. To love was to risk being broken, yet to withhold it was to be empty. And so, as dawn crept across the sky, the boy made a quiet vow. He would not cling too tightly to the thread, fearing others who joined it. He would learn to let it stretch, to allow his brother to weave bonds beyond their own, for perhaps that was the true strength of the silence, not to bind too tightly, but to endure even when distance and difference pulled at its seams. The next pause that came was gentler. His brother sat beneath a tree, laughter drifting once more, softened by weariness, but genuine still. This time, the boy did not resist the ache that followed. He let it wash through him, tender and bittersweet, for he understood now that the journey was not leading away from him, but outward into a world too wide for either to hold alone, and within that world, the silence would remain their meeting place, a reminder that no matter how far his brother wandered, a part of him would always return. The boy closed his eyes and let the silence fade, carrying with it both sorrow and hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the fire of companionship could both warm and burn, but he trusted now, not only in his brother's strength, but in the quiet that bound them still. The gift was no longer just his. It belonged to the journey itself. The morning after the fire dream paused, the boy moved more slowly as though every step he took was weighed down by something he could not put into words. The silence between him and his brother had begun to change, stretching, thinning, carrying echoes of others' laughter and quarrels and the fragile beginnings of loyalty. Yet it was not the voices themselves that unsettled him most. It was the tremor he felt beneath them, a faint uncertainty, like a note held too long that began to fray. Trust was delicate, and though his brother had stepped into it bravely, the boy sensed how easily it might falter. That day, while he walked to fetch water from the river, the pause deepened suddenly, pulling him like a tide. He staggered, spilling a little from the jug, and closed his eyes. What reached him then was heavier than anything he had felt before. A silence filled not with peace, but with the breath before a storm. His brother's thoughts moved restlessly, circling around suspicion. A voice, warmed just days earlier, now struck like a sharp blade, carrying accusation. Someone he had trusted had turned. The boy's chest tightened, and he gripped the jug until his knuckles whitened. He wanted to shout across the silence, to warn his brother, not to believe every promise, not to lean so fully on shoulders that might not bear the weight. But the gift did not carry his words that far. It carried only presence, only feeling. So he steadied himself, whispered softly into the emptiness, and sent a current of quiet strength. His brother, though he could not hear the words, might feel the calm. At least the boy hoped so. The pause lingered longer than usual, and the boy began to sense more betrayal was not a single act, but a pattern woven slowly. His brother's heart ached from discovering it too late. Companionship that had once warmed him now left cold ash in its place. There was no dramatic blow, no great unraveling in one instant, just the steady erosion of trust, until nothing could be held together. The boy felt the hollow grief of it, and in that grief, a strange resolve. His brother would walk on, but not unchanged. That evening, while the boy sat beside his grandmother, he did not tell her what he had felt, yet she seemed to sense something in the heaviness of his gaze. She touched his shoulder and murmured, "When a bond breaks, it does not mean the world is broken. It only means the world is asking us to grow differently." He let her words rest inside him like stones sinking gently into water, grounding him against the ache. Days passed, and the pauses brought fragments of his brother's solitude again. Quiet steps on an empty road, the weight of carrying on without the familiar warmth of laughter beside him. And yet beneath the sorrow, the boy noticed something new, a kind of clarity, a sharpening. Where once his brother had stretched himself too thin to meet the needs of others, now there was restraint, a carefulness in how he gave. He had not closed his heart entirely, but he had learned to hold it with more caution. The boy understood, then, that betrayal was not only loss, it was also lesson. Pain had shaped his brother, not cruelly but firmly, teaching him to walk with both caution and compassion. The silence carried that balance to the boy too, and he found himself applying it to his own days. Listening more carefully before offering trust, watching more closely before opening his heart. In this way, though they were apart, their growth remained twined. One night, the pause returned with startling vividness. His brother was seated by a fire, not alone, but with new companions, different voices, quieter, more careful. The boy sensed his brother's guardedness, how he watched the way they spoke, weighing words against actions. There was no reckless surrender of trust this time. Instead, he allowed warmth to build slowly, cautiously, like embers stirred to life. The boy smiled faintly, even as he felt the ache of distance. His brother was still open to the world, but now with wisdom. Yet even in this newfound steadiness, a shadow lingered. Betrayal left marks not easily erased. Sometimes in the middle of conversation, his brother's laughter would falter, the pause thickening with memory, as though he were remembering what it felt like to be deceived. The boy would feel it too, a hollow catch in his breath, a reminder that scars are quiet companions always near. And so the boy began to dream of how he might carry his own weight in this bond. Until now he had been the listener, the one absorbing what his brother felt. But perhaps, he thought, the silence could carry more than sorrow. Perhaps it could carry hope, strength, even gentle joy, if only he knew how to offer them. So he began to practice. When he awoke each morning, he filled his thoughts with gratitude for small things. The softness of moss beneath his feet, the warmth of his grandmother's hand, the shimmer of dawn light across the river. He tucked those feelings inside himself, like gifts waiting for the pause. And when it came, he released them, letting them drift into the stillness toward his brother. Sometimes it seemed to work. The pause would brighten unexpectedly and his brother's heart would lift, just slightly, as though catching the edge of comfort not his own. The boy did not know if his brother realized where it came from, but it was enough to know that he was not powerless, that he could give as well as receive. The gift, he realized, was never meant to be one-sided. It was a thread meant to carry not just pain, but love, not just warning, but reassurance. Betrayal had threatened to unravel it, but instead it had taught them both to weave it more carefully. And so the boy drifted into sleep that night with a quiet certainty. Whatever the road demanded of his brother, companionship, loss, endurance, the silence would remain their refuge, carrying not only the weight of sorrow but the gentleness of hope. And in that, perhaps they would always find one another again. The road was long, yes, but the bond was longer still. The days moved on with a rhythm both steady and uncertain, like the pulse of a drum muffled by distance. The boy had come to accept that silence would bring not only comfort but also trial, carrying both betrayal and hope across the invisible thread that bound him to his brother. Yet as the pauses continued, something new began to stir beneath them, an undercurrent deeper than laughter or sorrow, deeper even than trust lost or rebuilt. It was not tied to companionship or quarrel, but to something wider, something that seemed to belong to the world itself. The first time he noticed it was faint, almost hidden. He was standing at the river's edge, watching minnows dart beneath the ripples. When the pause enveloped him, his brother was alone, but not in despair. There was stillness in him, a stillness so profound it seemed to echo. The boy could feel his brother's breathing slow, feel how his mind was reaching outward, as though listening for something larger than his own footsteps. The sensation was strange, neither joy nor sorrow, but something like reverence. The boy drew in a breath, feeling it settle inside him. After that, the pauses began to change. They no longer came only when the world pressed upon his brother, but sometimes when his brother sought them deliberately, like doors he had learned how to open. The boy realized, with a start, that perhaps his brother had discovered the silence too. Not as a mystery happening to him, but as a path he could choose to walk. That possibility filled the boy with both wonder and fear. What would it mean if both of them were learning to dwell in the same unseen space? The glimpses that came were subtler now. Instead of betrayal's sting or laughter's warmth, the boy felt a hum low and steady as though the land itself were speaking. He saw in fragments his brother standing in a clearing at dusk, listening to wind curl through branches, or walking along a path marked with stones that seemed placed by careful hands. There was a sense of guidance, of movement towards something unseen yet calling. The boy shivered, not from cold but from the quiet gravity of it. His brother was no longer wandering aimlessly. He was being drawn. At home, the boy found himself restless. His grandmother noticed his distracted gaze, how he lingered by the hearth, even after the fire died, waiting as though for something more. One evening, she set down her weaving and said softly, "When the world whispers, child, it is not always to warn. Sometimes it is to invite. The question is not whether you hear it, but whether you choose to answer." The boy tucked her words into his heart, though he said nothing of the pauses. He wondered whether she somehow knew anyway. The pauses grew longer, steadier. Through them, the boy sensed his brother learning patience, standing for hours as though listening to the earth breathe, or sitting by waters that reflected stars. And in those moments, the boy felt not just his brother but something beyond him, a rhythm, a pattern, a belonging. It was as if the silence was not a thread between two hearts, but part of a vast web stretching out into places neither of them had yet seen. One night, as the boy drifted half asleep, the pause came like a wave. This time, it carried with it not the sting of betrayal nor the comfort of laughter, but a vision so vivid he almost gasped. His brother knelt beside a withered tree, laying his hand upon its bark. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then slowly he felt warmth flow outward, not his own, but something through him seeping into the tree. The branches trembled, a single leaf shivering loose and falling into the silence. The boy felt awe flood him, heavy and bright. His brother was not only listening to the world, he was becoming part of its voice. The boy lay awake long after the pause ended, his thoughts tangled with wonder. What was this gift truly meant for? Until now, he had seen it as thread between two brothers. Fragile but enduring. But perhaps it was more, a door to something greater. A calling neither had fully understood. He thought of his brother out there, walking roads that bent towards something vast. And he felt both proud and afraid. For callings, he knew, were heavy things. They gave meaning, but they also demanded. The days in his own village felt smaller in comparison, yet the boy did not resent them. Instead, he began to treat them differently. He listened more deeply to the rhythm of his grandmother's loom, to the hush of dusk settling over fields, to the sigh of wind across rooftops. In every sound, he wondered if there was more, an echo of the same web his brother was touching. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he almost felt it like a breath brushing past his skin. And in the pauses, he tried something new. He no longer sent only fragments of gratitude or comfort. He began to send questions, not in words but in longing. What are you learning? Where does this road lead? Do you feel what I feel? He did not know if his brother caught them. But sometimes the pause would return heavier, filled with quiet assurance. not answers, not exactly, but the sense that his brother knew he was not alone in the wondering. One evening, the pause stretched longer than ever before. His brother was walking under a sky thick with stars, and the boy could feel how every step was guided, how each breath carried both weariness and certainty. His brother no longer walked only for himself. Something larger had called him forward, something beyond companionship or survival. The boy felt it like a tide, pulling at them both. He sat by the hearth trembling and whispered aloud, "I will walk with you, even if my feet never touch the same road." The words echoed softly against the stone walls, fading into the hush of night. When the pause released him, he realized he was smiling through his tears. For the first time, he understood that their bond was not meant to keep them clinging, but to teach them how to walk outward together yet apart towards something neither yet fully grasped. The silence was no longer just a secret, it was a calling, and though he could not yet see where it led, he knew with quiet certainty that his brother's journey was shaping into something greater than either of them had imagined. The boy leaned back against the hearth, listening to the last crackle of the embers. The world was whispering now, not just to his brother, but to him as well. And when the time came, he knew he too would have to choose whether to answer. For callings once heard cannot be forgotten. The hush of the pauses had grown familiar now, no longer startling the boy when they came, but settling over him like the steady folding of twilight. And yet, with each passing day, they carried a new weight, as though the silence itself were gathering into something more than memory or emotion. It was no longer simply a bond between two brothers stretched across distance. It was beginning to reveal itself as a path, and the boy could feel how his brother was stepping deeper into it. What had once seemed like wandering now pulsed with direction. One afternoon, while the boy sat beneath the old willow by the river, the pause returned, soft at first, then deepening until he felt his breath hitch. His brother was not alone, though his companions seemed less like friends and more like seekers. Drawn together by a thread of purpose that none of them fully understood, but all of them trusted. The boy could feel their quiet awe, the way they followed his brother not because of command or force, but because something in him resonated with them. It was not leadership in the way of banners or shouts, but something gentler, steadier, like a lantern carried through darkness. His brother had become a guide without asking to be one. The boy's chest filled with a trembling kind of pride. He had always known his brother to be strong, not in the way of warriors or those who sought glory, but in the way of roots deep unseen, holding fast even when storms came. Now through the silence he felt that strength widening, becoming something others leaned upon, yet within it lingered fragility too. His brother still carried scars, the faint ache of betrayal, the cautious way he measured trust. The boy could sense how heavily responsibility pressed against those wounds, asking him to grow before he was ready. That night, while tending the fire, the boy wondered whether his brother realized the truth of it. Did he know that the silence itself had shaped him for this, teaching him to listen, to endure, to carry others in unseen ways? Or did he still believe himself simply walking forward, unaware of how the road bent around his steps? The boy longed to tell him, to speak into the stillness. You are becoming what you were meant to be. But words could not reach that far, so he let the thought drift, trusting the silence to carry what it could. The pauses began to bring not just feelings but images, more vivid than before. Once the boy saw his brother standing in a ruined place, stones broken and moss-covered, yet beneath his hands something stirred. Light moved faintly through cracks, as though the earth itself remembered and responded. Another time he felt his brother kneel beside someone weeping, offering no grand speeches, only presence, and in that simple stillness, healing began. These glimpses filled the boy with wonder. His brother was not merely surviving the road, nor only seeking companionship. He was answering something older, something larger, something that asked for both strength and humility. The boy began to notice how even his own small life was touched by it. When he spoke gently to the younger children in the village, when he offered his grandmother quiet company, when he listened to the hush of the fields at dusk, he felt the same rhythm moving through him. It was as though the silence was not only his brother's calling, but his as well, threads of one design tugging at them both, weaving them into something beyond themselves. One evening, as stars emerged like scattered seeds in the sky, the pause came with a clarity that took his breath. His brother was speaking not to the boy, but to those gathered with him. The boy could not hear every word, yet he felt the weight of them, the way they flowed not from cleverness but from a deep place of listening. His brother spoke of journeys not made alone, of wounds that carried wisdom, of silence that did not mean emptiness but presence. And those around him listened, their hearts bending toward him the way flowers bend toward light. The boy pressed his hands together, trembling. This was it, the shaping of his brother's purpose. Not to command, not to conquer, but to remind others of what was already within them. The silence had taught him, and now he was teaching through it. The boy felt tears blur his vision, not from sorrow but from the strange beauty of it all. His brother had found a place in the world, and it was not distant from the boy after all. It was part of the same web that had always bound them. Still, with awe came fear, for callings carried weight, and weight could break even the strongest if carried alone. The boy could feel how weary his brother sometimes became, how the silence pressed heavily against him in the quiet hours, and so the boy began to offer more intentionally into the pauses. Not just fleeting gratitude, but steady strength. He would sit in stillness, filling his heart with patience, with love, with the memory of their shared beginnings, and then let it flow outward, hoping it would steady his brother when the road grew too heavy. It was not long before he sensed it working. In one pause, his brother's heart, strained and tired, steadied suddenly as though caught by an unseen hand. In another, he felt a flicker of warmth, quick and certain, breaking through despair. The boy smiled softly, realizing that even if his brother never knew it, he was walking beside him in his own way. They were threads of the same design, woven far apart yet pulling strength from each other. And so, as the nights grew longer and the pauses deepened, the boy accepted what he had once resisted. The silence was not a burden nor even a secret bond meant only for them. It was a gift, a doorway into something larger. His brother's calling was becoming clear: to listen, to guide, to bring stillness where the world was fractured, and his own role, though quieter, was no less real: to hold the thread steady, to keep the silence alive, to remind his brother he was never alone in carrying it. As he lay down that night, the boy whispered into the darkness, "Wherever this road takes you, I will be there in the pauses." And for the first time, the silence answered not with words, but with a warmth that filled his chest, as though his brother far away had heard. The boy drifted to sleep, knowing now that neither of them walked by accident. They were part of a design unfolding slowly, softly, like a story whispered into the night. The warmth that had answered the boy's whispered vow lingered within him through the days that followed, like an ember refusing to fade. It gave his steps a steadiness he had not known before. And though nothing outwardly had changed, he still tended the fire, still fetched water from the stream, still lingered beneath the willow. Everything inwardly felt altered. The silence was no longer only a thread between him and his brother. It had become a current moving beneath the surface of all things. Wherever he walked, he felt it humming, quiet but alive, waiting to be noticed. One evening, when the boy sat listening to the stillness of the fields, he felt the pause arrive with unusual weight. It pressed gently, then deepened until he felt as though he were standing beside his brother once more. What he sensed was not triumph, nor despair, but a kind of threshold. His brother stood before something vast, something that would demand the full measure of what he had become. The boy could almost see it through the silence. A gathering of people, expectant, carrying wounds both old and raw. They did not look to his brother for miracles, but for something quieter, something they had forgotten was possible. Hope. The boy's breath caught. He knew this was no ordinary moment. Every pause, every fragment of silence, every scar and every act of endurance had led to this gathering. His brother had been shaped not for himself alone, but for these people, and perhaps for countless others, yet unseen. And though the boy could not hear the words spoken, he felt the atmosphere shifting, as though a heavy door had creaked open in the hearts of those present. It was not noise that changed them, but listening, the kind his brother had learned from the silence itself. In that moment, the boy understood something he had never dared to think. The bond they shared was not just for their comfort, nor merely a thread of love stretched across distance. It was part of a larger weaving, a design that was using them both to touch others. His brother stood in the center of that design, carrying light into places where darkness had been assumed eternal. The boy, though hidden far away, was part of the pattern too. His quiet offerings, his whispered strength in the pauses, had become unseen pillars beneath his brother's steps. The days moved forward and the pauses shifted with them. They grew less frantic, less weighted with the ache of loneliness, and more steady, as though his brother had found a rhythm in the road. The boy could sense both weariness and peace braided together, the kind of peace that did not erase struggle but accompanied it. Often the pauses carried with them echoes of laughter, strange, fragile, but real. His brother, once defined by solitude, was now learning the courage to share joy, even if it flickered only for moments. The boy wondered what it must feel like to stand where his brother stood, to speak into silence and have it ripple outward into the hearts of strangers. And yet, the more he thought on it, the more he realized he did not envy him. Each role had its own weight, its own necessity. His brother bore the visible burden, the kind that shaped destinies and drew others close. The boy bore the hidden one, keeping the silence alive, ensuring that its strength never faltered. Neither could exist without the other, and in this balance there was something unbreakable. Still, a question lingered at the edges of his heart. Where would this road lead? What would be asked of his brother next? And how far could endurance stretch before it frayed? He had learned enough from the silence to know that no story stays still. Every threshold leads to another. Every moment of rest gives way to a new rising demand. He feared what might come, feared whether his brother would have to give more than anyone's soul should, and whether his own hidden strength would be enough to hold him. The night sky seemed to sense his doubt, for as he lay beneath it, the pause returned, not heavy this time, but tender. Through it, the boy felt his brother's presence more clearly than ever, as though the distance between them had folded away. What came was not words, but the steady reassurance of recognition. The brother had felt him, had known he was there. The boy smiled, his chest loosening. Whatever storms might rise, they would not face them unanchored. As the season shifted and the air grew colder, the pauses brought new images. The boy saw his brother walking through valleys where mist clung low, and over ridges where the wind howled with a voice like grief. He saw him entering villages where distrust met him first, suspicion etched on every face, yet leaving behind eyes softened by something unseen. He saw him sitting in silence with the broken, not filling the space with words but letting the stillness itself do the healing. Each image felt like a page being turned in a story far older than their lifetimes. The boy realized then that legacy was already forming, not the kind written in stone or sung in loud voices, but the quieter kind, passed from one life to another like a lantern. His brother's light was not his own alone, it was borrowed from the silence, and it would be carried by others long after he moved on. And perhaps the boy himself would one day pass it, not with speeches or commands, but with simple presence, with the patience of listening. One night, as the fire crackled low and the stars seemed brighter for the cold, the boy allowed himself to imagine a future where both of them were old, where the silence had carried them through all its seasons. He pictured his brother seated beside him, lines of weariness and wisdom etched deep, their shared bond still alive, steady as breath. He knew the road ahead might not grant such peace, but the imagining steadied him nonetheless. For now it was enough to know that every pause was part of a greater unfolding, enough to know that he was not simply waiting but participating. Enough to trust that the silence which had carried them so far would not abandon them now. And as the embers dimmed into ash, the boy whispered once more, softer than before, "I am here." The silence stirred gently, and he felt the answering warmth again, proof that no matter how vast the world became, or how heavy the road, their thread would hold. The boy's whisper lingered in the quiet, and though no answer came in words, the silence that followed seemed fuller, as if it had been listening. For many nights it had been a comfort, a bridge that kept loneliness at bay, but now it began to carry something more difficult. There were moments when the pauses pressed heavy, when the stillness no longer soothed but demanded, as though asking the boy to bear what he had not yet chosen to bear. It was no longer only his brother's silence, but his own, reflecting back pieces of himself he had not wished to see. At first he resisted. He tried to fill the spaces with idle thought, with imagined scenes of joy or simple tasks to occupy his mind. But the silence was patient, and it returned again and again, refusing to be covered. Slowly, the boy realized this was its way of shaping him, just as it had shaped his brother. It was not always gentle. Sometimes it was raw, pulling at the tender places he had tried to keep hidden. Yet even in its sternness, it carried love, the kind that pushes growth rather than coddles weakness. The boy saw through the pauses that his brother, too, was walking through trial. The warmth he had once felt so strongly now came with edges, with currents of weariness and weight. His brother carried others' burdens as though they were his own, and though he gave freely, the silence revealed how it cost him dearly. There were nights when his strength thinned, when the fire in his heart faltered, and yet he walked on, refusing to let despair undo him. The boy felt both pride and sorrow, wishing he could stand beside him, wishing his own voice could offer more than this invisible tether. Yet the silence reminded him his brother's strength did not come from standing alone. It came from knowing he was never alone, from knowing someone somewhere held him quietly in their care. The boy realized then that his role was not lesser. It was necessary. His presence in the unseen spaces was the balance that allowed his brother to carry the visible weight. Without one, the other would collapse. The boy began to listen differently. Instead of only waiting for his brother's presence, he began to hear the silence as a mirror of his own soul. It asked him to remember moments from his childhood, times when he had been fragile and afraid, yet somehow carried through. He recalled the nights when he had cried softly, thinking no one had heard, but then found comfort the next day in a smile, a gesture, a kindness from his brother. Perhaps the silence had always been there, long before they noticed it, woven into their lives like a thread waiting to be pulled. There came a night when the pause arrived with great force. It pulled him into stillness so complete he felt he could not move. His breath slowed, and for a moment it seemed as though the world had vanished. In that vast quiet, an image formed not of his brother this time, but of himself, older, standing in a place he did not recognize. He was surrounded by others, their eyes upon him, waiting. He felt the same weight his brother bore now, and the realization shook him. Could it be that one day the silence would lead him into the open, calling him to carry what he had long thought was his brother's path alone? The image faded, but it remained within him, unsettling and luminous. He wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was only a dream born of longing, yet the silence held it steady, as though saying not yet, but someday. He lay awake long into the night, turning it over in his heart, torn between fear and wonder. If such a time came, would he be ready? Could he hold others as his brother held them? Could he give without losing himself? The days that followed carried an undercurrent of this question. The boy noticed the way the pauses shaped him now, not only softening, but sharpening, carving strength into him in ways he had not asked for. The willow where he sat seemed to know as well, its branches whispering with a depth he had not heard before. He would lean against its trunk and imagine that the roots reaching deep into the earth were teaching him patience, while the branches reaching high taught him courage. Everything around him became part of the silence lesson. And through it all, the bond with his brother did not weaken. In fact, it deepened. There were pauses where he felt laughter again, fleeting but real, and others where he sensed the ache of exhaustion pressing harder than ever. But always, beneath the shifting emotions, there was trust. The same trust that had carried them since the first time the silence answered. There were two lives walking different paths, yet held together by the same thread, each giving the other what they could not give themselves. One night, as frost silvered the fields, and the stars seemed to lean closer than usual, the boy felt the silence swell with a kind of farewell. Not an ending, but a soft preparation. His brother was moving towards something that would demand all of him, and though the boy could not see clearly what it was, he felt the gravity of it. The silence urged him not to fear, but to hold steady, to trust that what was being asked had purpose beyond their understanding. The boy pressed his palm to the earth, whispering as though the soil itself could carry his words, "I will not let you fall." The silence trembled with warmth, answering in its wordless way, and the boy knew his vow had been received. In that moment, he stopped resisting the weight of what might come. He understood that love, at its deepest, is not about shielding another from trial, but about standing firm enough that they do not walk it alone. And so he let the silence continue its work in him, even when it was heavy, even when it revealed more than he wished to see, for he knew now it was shaping him not only for the present, but for the day when he too might be asked to step into the open and carry light into shadows. The fire burned low that night, casting long, soft shadows. The boy lay down with his heart, both heavy and peaceful, knowing that the road was far from finished, but also that the silence would never abandon them. He closed his eyes, breathing in the stillness, and felt the thread hum between them once more, steady and unbreakable. The boy slept that night, with the silence pressed close around him, like a cloak laid gently across his shoulders. When dawn came, the air was pale and thin, and for the first time in many years he felt that the pause he carried with him was changing shape. It was not gone, it would never be gone, but its rhythm had softened into something both tender and inevitable. He sensed, without fully knowing, that the thread between him and his brother was nearing a threshold neither of them could resist. The silence was not ending, it was guiding them toward a kind of farewell. At first he resisted the thought. Farewell sounded like loss, like absence, like a severing of what had become the deepest truth of his life. He whispered to the silence in protest, as though words could hold back time. "Do not take him from me. Do not undo what we have kept." The stillness received his plea, but instead of answering with warmth, it gave him quiet honesty. Love, it seemed to say, is not measured by clinging, but by the strength to release. The boy turned this over in his heart, and found that it cut deep. The pauses that followed were unlike any he had felt before. They carried not only his brother's presence, but the weight of years, the laughter, the scars, the small mercies, the countless unspoken exchanges that had built the bond between them. Each pause seemed to offer him a memory, his brother's hand steadying him when he stumbled as a child, his quiet smile across the table when words were unnecessary, the nights they had watched stars together, wondering if anyone else in the world saw what they saw. The silence gathered all these moments, holding them up one by one, not to sadden him, but to remind him of their fullness. And still beneath it all there was the pull of departure. His brother's presence in the pauses grew fainter, not absent, but stretched thinner, as though the road he walked was drawing him further into mystery. The boy could feel that his brother was nearing a crossing, a place where even the silence itself could not quite follow in the same way. It frightened him, but he also sensed a strange gentleness in it, like the hush before sleep overtakes a weary soul. The boy leaned against the willow one evening, watching the last light fade, and spoke softly, "If you must go, go knowing I have loved you well. Go knowing I will carry the silence you gave me." As he spoke, the branches seemed to sigh above him, and the pause that answered was fragile, trembling, yet filled with gratitude. He understood then that his brother had heard him, that his words had reached across the distance like a final embrace. The days that followed were slow, dreamlike. The boy walked the fields, tended the fire, fetched the water, but everything felt touched by the awareness of nearing change. The silence no longer pressed with questions or demands. It had become soft like the breath of someone falling asleep. In those quiet hours, the boy began to realize that farewell was not truly an ending. The thread they had woven together did not break. It only shifted, becoming less about presence and more about memory, less about exchange and more about carrying forward. On the night when the farewell came, he felt it without warning. The pause arrived, heavier than it had ever been, filling every corner of him until he thought he might break under its weight. Then, slowly, it began to thin, like mist lifting from the ground. In its place was a vast, aching stillness, empty and yet alive. His brother's presence, once so near, was no longer there in the same way. But what remained was not loss. It was a deep, enduring peace. The boy wept then, not with despair, but with release. His tears fell into the earth at the willow's roots, and as they sank into the soil, he felt the silence stir one last time, offering him a truth he could carry forever. Love does not vanish. It becomes part of the ground beneath us, the air around us, the light that lingers even when the fire has gone out. From that night onward, the boy no longer waited in the pauses for his brother's presence. Instead, he listened to the silence itself, which had now become wholly his. It held the echo of all they had shared, and in its depths, he found not emptiness, but a quiet companionship. Wherever he walked, the thread hummed, not outward toward another, but inward, reminding him that he had been shaped by love, and that love was never undone. Years passed, and the boy grew older. The willow thickened, its branches spreading wide, its roots running deeper. He often sat beneath it, letting the silence move through him like an old friend. Others sometimes came near, drawn by something they could not name. They would sit beside him, unburden their hearts, and leave with a strange lightness. The boy never explained. He simply listened, and in listening, he shared what had been given to him. He understood then what the silence had shown him in that vision long ago. One day he too would stand where his brother once stood, offering not miracles but presence, not answers but listening. And in that way the legacy continued, not in the noise of greatness but in the quiet endurance of love. On the last evening of his life, when his hair had silvered and his hands had grown unsteady, he lay once more beneath the willow. The sky above him was strewn with stars, and the silence wrapped around him with the same warmth that had the first night it answered his heart. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, and whispered the words that had carried him all his days. "I am here." The silence trembled, and for a moment he thought he felt his brother's presence again. Not distant this time, but near, as if waiting just beyond the veil of sleep. He smiled, and with that he let himself drift into the silence, fully knowing he was not entering absence, but returning to the thread that had never left him. And somewhere, whether in memory or in dream or in the deep fabric of the world itself, he was still out there, resting in the quiet, carried by the love that had shaped his every breath. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man.